Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 541. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how's it going?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Happy to have you back on the show today, although we really don't have any good news to talk about, so it's not that happy. But a lot to discuss on today's show, and if you can, please share out the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. Of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at con_interest, and then keep up with everything going on at the Institute and everything I'm doing just by going over to the site and checking it out. I write news stories there every day. We post stuff on the blog, particularly, when we have a big appearance on another podcast. I'll be back on Judging Freedom with Andrew Napolitano tomorrow. That's Thursday, February 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. If you can tune in live, that would be great. If not, check it out after. And Connor, let's get into the news for today's show. Couple stories up here. And actually, I guess a little bit of good news, Connor. Congress isn't making really any progress here on passing the additional aid for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. Oh, and they're going to stick a little bit of funding for the border in it and then call it a border law. So interesting how that propaganda works. But this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. McConnell says $118 billion military aid and border bill will not become law. So Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said Tuesday that the $118 billion military aid and border bill unveiled over the weekend will likely not become law due to GOP opposition. We had a very robust discussion about whether or not this product could ever become law, McConnell said, and it's been made pretty clear to us by the speaker that it will not become law. A day earlier, the Associated Press reported that McConnell recommended to GOP senators that they vote for the first procedural vote on the bill that's expected to happen on Wednesday. House Speaker Mike Johnson has said that the bill is dead on arrival, and he is looking to push forward a standalone resolution to give Israel more aid to support the slaughter in Gaza, which got shot down. We'll talk about that next. The Republican opposition to the $118 billion bill is over the border policies. Senate negotiators spent months working on a border deal for the legislation, but Johnson said the House was left out. Democrats are blaming Republican opposition and former President Donald Trump, who has expressed that he is against the legislation. So, Connor, this seems like good news to me. At some point, I do imagine that the White House really will be out of funding to arm Ukraine. Now, I guess, they currently don't have any more funds to arm Ukraine, but there are some things that they previously funded, like those long-range bombs that I recently wrote about and covered at the Libertarian Institute that are still being shipped to Ukraine. There's other countries that are trying to some extent plug the holes that America is leaving some of the European nations. But eventually, the bill's going to come due here, and either Congress is going to have to pass more funding for the White House, or Ukraine is going to have to really reconsider what they're doing. Now, I guess, I'm not very optimistic about Congress. And so I imagine, Connor, that at some point, if it really comes down to it, Congress will get together, even if it's in the middle of the night, and they're going to write some funding level for Ukraine in the tens of millions of dollars and just pass it and make sure that they could kick the can down the road on this issue. However, that hasn't happened yet. And also, I guess the other concern I have is that maybe the White House does something really unconstitutional and takes funding from something else, starts confiscating Russian funds to buy his weapons or something like that, to get really creative, to buy weapons for Ukraine to keep this war going even without congressional authorization. So I'm not convinced that this is going to cause the war in Ukraine to end, but it certainly seems like we're getting to the point where if there's not more funding, then there's going to have to be a real discussion about how this is funded going forward, or if it has to end. Now, this is less important in the sense, Connor, that we're not talking about a bill that necessarily would have ended, that Israel doesn't need our continued funding to wage the war in Gaza. Now, certainly, with the size of their economy, it's not a very large state, and using these big expensive bombs and F-16s is very expensive. So I'm sure this aid would be really helpful, but this isn't going to be a green light on the war or not. It's more just how much America is underwriting the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So Dave DeCamp writes this for antiwar.com. House fails to pass $17.6 billion Israeli military aid bill. So the House on Tuesday sank an effort by Speaker Mike Johnson to pass the almost $18 billion military aid bill for Israel to support the slaughter in Gaza. The bill was fast-tracked under a suspension of House rules, requiring it to have 2/3 majority to be advanced to the Senate, but the bill failed on a vote of 250 to 180, with 166 Democrats and 14 Republicans voting against it. So Chip Roy said, well, it's unpaid for and our borders are wide open. Can't go to my constituents and say, here's 17 billion for someone who I love, like Israel, and a good friend, somebody I fully support. I can't do that. So, not great here, Connor, his rhetoric, but hey, at least he voted against it. Thomas Massey, who was a little bit better, most of this money will go directly to the U.S. military industrial complex, which, if you're keeping up, prefers to be referred to as the defense industrial base now. Watch for those stats to go up on Monday. And so, Connor, fortunately, this didn't get moved forward. Now, again, I imagine that Israel is going to get some funding, that eventually some bill is going to get through. My fear is that since this bill was $17.6 billion, that means this is the new minimum floor for how much aid Israel is going to get, and it's not going to be the $14.3 billion number that was initially put in the Biden bill. But we'll see how this moves forward and continue to cover it on the show. I don't want to be overly pessimistic and just say, like, eventually they're going to ram something through and these wars will go on completely funded by the U.S. taxpayer. But maybe we get lucky here, Connor. It does still seem that there's a majority in both the House and the Senate that are willing to support all these wars. It's just the debate around the extra issues and the politics behind it. All right, next up here, some news on Israel. CNN staffers say network has systematic and institutional bias towards Israel. Well, not a surprise that this is, getting reported, just a surprise that the CNN staffers are speaking out here, and the outlet that's reporting it is interesting. So several employees of CNN spoke out against the outlet's bias towards Israel in its reporting on the war in Gaza. Other U.S. corporate media outlets have shown significant favoritism towards Tel Aviv. The Guardian reports speaking with 6 staffers from different newsrooms who said that there's a growing backlash against the leadership of pro-Israel slant. The majority of news since the war began, regardless of how accurate the initial reporting, has been skewed by a systematic and institutional bias within the network towards Israel, one CNN staffer said. Ultimately, CNN's coverage of the Israel-Gaza war amounts to journalistic malpractice. Another staffer explained, there's a lot of internal strife and dissent. Some people are looking to get out. Senior staffers who disagree with the status quo are butting heads with the executives giving orders, questioning how effectively the story with such restrictive directives in place. A staff speaking with The Guardian explained how systematic censorship occurs. He said, many have been pushing for more content from Gaza to be alerted and aired. By the time these reports go through Jerusalem and make it to TV or the homepage, critical changes from the introduction of imprecise language to an ignorance of crucial stories ensure that nearly every report, no matter how damning, relieves Israel of wrongdoing. The CNN employees say the bias starts from the top, with CEO Mark Thompson, who took office, took the position just a couple days after October 7th, I believe, or just around the same time, might have been a couple days before. But The Guardian obtained emails and emails and memos and other things that backed up the accusations by the CNN staffers. So the employees say that the slant is causing backlash. In one memo obtained by The Guardian, Thompson gave orders that all stories mentioning the atrocities committed by the Israelis in Gaza must mention the war is only occurring because of the Hamas attack on October 7th. The memo reads, "We must continue always to remind our audience of the immediate cause of this current conflict, namely the Hamas attack and the mass murder and kidnap of civilians." One staffer confirmed that the memo was interpreted as an instruction that no matter what the Israelis do, Hamas is ultimately to blame. CNN's bias towards Tel Aviv is matched by the Washington Post and New York Times. Writing at FAIR, Julie Haller explains, at the New York Times and Washington Post, opinion editors have skewed the Gaza debate towards Israel-centered perspective, dominated by men and among guest writers and government officials. While both papers include strong pro-Palestinian voices, their pages lean heavily towards the conversation dominated by Israeli interest and concerns. That was due in large part to their stable of regular columnists who tend to write from a perspective aligned with Israel. As a result, the viewpoint readers most likely to encounter on the opinion pages of the two papers were sympathetic to, but not necessarily uncritical of Israel. And Connor, I think this is important too, just to note here that the regulars at these outlets, the people who get, paid a salary to write there and everything like that, are the ones that are so biased towards Israel, where they actually had to bring in outside writers to try to, even skew the perspective just a little bit more towards the middle. And there are horrific things going on in Gaza in the West Bank right now. We're going to talk about some of what's going on in the West Bank. There was a new report from Amnesty International, and I wrote about it at the Libertarian Institute. So Amnesty International documents shocking spike in illegal force against Palestinians in the West Bank, February 6th. A new report from Amnesty International documents that over the past 4 months, Israeli forces unleashed a brutal wave of violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. The organization found that Israeli forces murdered children, brutally cracked down on protesters, and blocked ambulances from reaching injured Palestinians to provide medical care. The death toll for children in the West Bank since the outbreak of war in Gaza has now hit 100. The Amnesty report released on Monday investigated several Israeli military operations in the West Bank in October and November. The report said the organization investigated 4 emblematic cases where Israeli forces used unlawful lethal force, 3 incidents in October and 1 in November, which resulted in the unlawful killing of 20 Palestinians, including 7 children. Tel Aviv has cracked down on the West Bank throughout 2023. The Israeli government that came to power in late December of 2022, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, gave an unprecedented amount of power to 2 ministers, the Religious Zionism Party leader Smotrich and the Jewish Power Party leader Itamar Ben-Gvir, over security in the West Bank. Predictably, the influence of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich led to increased violence in the West Bank against Palestinians. Tel Aviv made the expansion of settlements in the West Bank a top priority, and Israel stepped up military operations there as well. Over 180 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank before October 7th attack. Since Israel began its military campaign in Gaza, Tel Aviv has also escalated raids and airstrikes on the West Bank, killing 383 Palestinians, including 100 children. According to the Amnesty report, some of the deaths could have been prevented by allowing first responders to reach injured Palestinians. The report says the obstruction of medical assistance by Israeli forces during operations across the West Bank is a routine practice Amnesty International has documented for years and is a part of Israel's systematic apartheid. Under international law, Israeli forces have an obligation to ensure that anyone injured by their forces is able to access medical treatment. Amnesty International has investigated 5 occasions where Israeli forces hindered or prevented those seriously injured in demonstrations and raids from receiving critical medical assistance. They also shot Palestinians trying to help, including medics tending to the wounded. To prevent injured Palestinians from receiving medical care, Israeli forces fired on ambulances and shot paramedics. The report documented that Israel used lethal force against Palestinian protesters in the West Bank. Palestinians in the West Bank have held frequent protests against the genocide in Gaza. Some young men have been documented throwing stones and using fireworks, while the Israeli forces have use live ammunition. Israeli forces' use of lethal force in response to the youth throwing stones is at odds with the right to life under international humanitarian right law and international standards regulating the use of force in policing. Lethal force in law enforcement can only be used when there is an imminent threat to life. Its use is not proportionate response to stone throwing. And Connor, if we could imagine back to 2020 in America, have police officers just gone out in response to the Black Lives Matter protest or the, anti-vax, anti-masking, anti-lockdown protests and just opened fire on people. We've seen 383 Palestinians killed. So, this is a significant number of people. Now all those people have been killed in protests, but, still. And then the blocking of ambulances seems to be, one of the things that should really offend just anybody, right? The one thing you should allow is for medical staff to address the wounded and sort out the situation later. But this has been documented many times, including one case where, somebody bled out over a couple hours. First, they blocked the ambulance from getting there. And then once the man was in the ambulance, they said he had to have his ID to be ordered to, travel through the checkpoints. And when people tried to go get his ID for him, so he wouldn't bleed out in the back of the ambulance, that they blocked those people from leaving to do that. All right, Connor, a couple stories here on the UN Palestinian Aid Agency, UNRWA, which is one of the most important agencies and organizations to getting aid into Gaza right now. And so this has to do with the fact that the U.S. and 17 other countries to this point, the U.S. and Germany, the two largest backers to the organization, have pulled their funding over allegations made by Israel that 12 of its staff members participated in the October 7th attack, and that there is links from UNRWA staff, which there's 12,000 or 13,000, between 12 and 13,000 staff members in Gaza. So they allege that those 12 to 13,000 staff members, hundreds have ties to Hamas, and other, thousands more have at least distant relatives that are members of Hamas. So the thing that is going on here, Connor, is they released a 6-page summary of their intelligence dossier that Israel is distributing to select sources. And two of those sources were the Daily Beast and Channel 4 News in the UK. And Channel 4 News showed what looks to be like, a redacted outline of those reports. And there is not much here. So the 12 people pictured takes up several of the 6 pages, and then on the other page it just says, we have, this documented evidence, but they don't present any of it whatsoever. And so the Daily Beast and CBS News in the US also said that there was just no evidence provided here. The Daily Beast reported an Israeli intelligence dossier spelling out the allegations that dozens of staff at the United Nations top aid agency participating in an October 7th attack includes little evidence to back up those claims. CBS News noted that the dossier made assertions without providing evidence. Now, you would think that the Daily Beast, CBS News, Channel 4 in the UK, Connor, if they're skeptical of this, well, the U.S. government is going to be, but that's not the case. Secretary of State Antony Blinken admitted that the U.S. has not verified the Israeli allegations, but, said that the U.S. believes them, and they moved ahead with cutting the aid anyways. Now, initially, Connor, I thought it really doesn't even matter if 12 low-level staff members of UNRWA participated in the Hamas attack. You could imagine that there's plenty of people who had jobs with UNRWA for years and years and years, and maybe some of their family members were killed during the Great March of Return or the Israeli bombing campaigns of 2021 and 2022, and they decided to join an armed organization in response to that, or, just the personal... maybe their kid was trying to get a visa to go to a hospital in Jerusalem or the West Bank for cancer treatment, and that was denied. And so, those kind of things I'm sure do drive Palestinians who are maybe working normal jobs to decide to take up arms with Hamas. At the same time, just low level people end up getting employed at different places. And if you listen to UNRWA and how their process works, every year they provide Israel with a full list of all their employees. And if Israel wants to strike any name, those people are fired. That's automatically how it works. And so, Israel, if they had an issue with these people, they could have had them dismissed from UNRWA, and they never did. But anyways, that is kind of the first part of the story. The second part is that Israel has this big intelligence dossier that they claim to have on the UNRWA participation in the attack, Connor. And guess what? They're not releasing the whole thing. And so this sounds an awful lot like the claims of sexual violence on October 7th, where now there's no public reports of, any documented cases of rape on October 7th. But Israel says that we have this intelligence dossier that we are keeping private that does document that. And the problem is, if you keep lying like the Israelis are, if you look at the destruction of the cemetery, they even brought a CNN reporter to try to, provide a propaganda piece about how we're only destroying cemeteries because there's Hamas tunnels under them. Even that CNN reporter didn't find a Hamas tunnel under that cemetery, and CNN reported as such. And so, these claims by Israel are really problematic, and they're probably untrue. Now, the problem is, Connor, it may not matter. And there's a couple reasons behind that. One, the UN has launched an investigation, but that's not going to be done until sometime in March. And UNRWA says they only have funds to continue operating through the end of February. And so if they had to stop providing aid to Gaza, then famine is going to set in very, very quickly. And this has been warned by several officials. And even the Israelis are concerned. Get this. The Israelis are concerned, Connor, that if UNRWA shuts down in the short term, that what's going to happen in Gaza will be such a massive humanitarian crisis that they will receive too much pressure to shut down their military operations, and they'll have to end the war. However, in the long run, Israel wants UNRWA to get shut down or to undergo significant reforms, and that's what the U.S. says they want as well. So it doesn't appear that this organization is going to exist in the long term. To be honest, Connor, it doesn't seem like Palestinians are going to be allowed to remain in Gaza in the long term. Israel is working on an ethnic cleansing campaign here. They have advanced very far down that path. They are now setting their sights on Rafah, the last major city there. And the situation for the Palestinians is getting worse and worse. I found this one from an Associated Press report. They interviewed a pediatrician that was operating in Gaza. This is Dr. Hassan Bashir, and he tells the AP that what has recently appeared in the scenes is hepatitis A, and the infection resulted from densely populated places due to war and displaced people in tents. And so he's talking about hepatitis A circling among young Gazan children. And the last story I have here before I hand it over to you, Connor. Right. Okay. Last one before I hand it over to you here, Connor. Former U.S. military commander says Israel's success in Gaza is very limited. And so this from Day to Camp at antiwar.com. Retired U.S. Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, he's the former commander of CENTCOM, described Israel's success in Gaza as very limited, noting Israel has failed to dismantle the Palestinian group and its political leadership. And Connor, one of the real problems here is, and this is what we have noted all along, is that the mass slaughter of civilians in Gaza will certainly drive other Palestinians to want to take up arms against Israel. And so if you only kill low-level members of Hamas, and it seems that a lot of what Israel did throughout this war is just target anyone who they could possibly identify as a low level member of Hamas, but not, trying to take them out in a targeted strike, but rather just blow up their homes in an excuse to conduct, widespread sweeping death and destruction in Gaza. And so, this is likely probably driven, far more support to, the Palestinians rightfully believing that the only way they're going to have a homeland is to fight Israel for it at this point. And so if the only fighting force against Israel is Hamas, it's no surprise there. All right, Connor, I'm going to hand over to you. I know you got quite a few stories here, including a new one that's out just today at the Libertarian Institute.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is again, we're talking about Israel's lies and complete lack of credibility here, with all the canards about tunnels under cemeteries and these lies. Well, it would almost certainly are lies regarding UNRWA employees in being involved in the October 7th attack. I mean, I always presume that the Israelis are lying, and since they're showing that they've showed their cards, at least with this summary of the intelligence dossier, they don't have any evidence. There's no reason to assume that they actually do have it, and they're just withholding it. And so, similarly here, there's been so much reporting about, at least in Israeli media and independent media here in the States, about the Hannibal Directive being implemented during the October 7th attack, where Israeli civilians were killed in significant numbers. No one knows exactly how many, or to get a. I'm not sure if there's too many accurate estimates out there, but certainly several Israeli civilians were killed during the attack by the Israeli military. But now the IDF, 4 months into their genocidal ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza, have decided to begin to open an investigation into whether or not they were responsible for any sort of breaches of law or killings of their own citizens on that day. So I write here, the Israeli military said on Tuesday they launched a probe into friendly fire deaths and possible breaches of the law during fighting in Israel, which occurred in response to the October 7 Hamas attack and in its immediate wake. Several reports in Israeli media have indicated multiple civilians were killed by Israeli military fire. Haaretz says that the investigation is going to focus primarily on an incident in Kibbutz Be'eri, where a house holding more than a dozen Israeli civilians and their Hamas captives was shelled by an Israeli tank, leaving one survivor. A hostage who was released from the house by a Hamas fighter, as well as a single survivor of the tank attack, have since confirmed the story. And the IDF, the statement the military put out is the IDF is operating the fact-finding and assessment mechanism to examine reports and complaints regarding the violation of Israeli and international law during the fighting. It adds that the investigation is in its early stages and materials are being collected. And they say once the probe is completed, then the materials will be transferred to the Military Advocate General's office, and then a decision will be made whether sufficient grounds exist to begin a military police investigation. Now, the October 7 attack saw nearly 400 military personnel killed, as well as 695 Israeli civilians, and some dozens of foreigners. And an unknown but potentially high number of those civilian casualties were taken at the hands of the Israeli military. So the attack itself, as well as the inflated death toll, which has been reduced repeatedly over these past months by the Israeli authorities, was used as a casus belli, or have been used as a casus belli, to justify really the massive onslaught into Gaza, the ethnic cleansing policy, and making the strip completely uninhabitable by just, I mean, bombing it worse in terms of percentage of infrastructure destroyed than Dresden. And they've used this horror story with so many different elements of, a lot of it is so much of it is propaganda. In fact, Haaretz did a report where they collected all these fake stories that were, that circulated throughout the West as well, and in the United States, getting people all juiced up to support, or at least an attempt to get people very juiced up to support this mass carnage in response, whether it's the beheaded babies or the mass rapes. But now this is obviously a big part of Israel's strategy, is to use this story and also to cover up their own responsibility for killing their own people and for allowing the attack to happen. I mean, whether or not, of course, we're totally against the occupation, but even if their citizens support the siege on Gaza and keeping those people under crushed under the blockade and in their open air prison, you'd think that they would be, and they are. There's, Netanyahu's in a lot of hot water over the security breaches and the failure to protect his own people. But anyway, since then, more than 27,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, including over 11,000 children. 70% of the casualties are women and children. And so, a recent investigation by the Israeli outlet Ynet indicates that the Hannibal Directive, this notorious Israeli policy, which intends to prevent Israelis being captured by enemy forces, even if it means killing the hostages themselves, was implicitly implemented in response to the October 7 assault. The policy, which dates back to the 1980s during Israel's brutal occupation of southern Lebanon, is designed to preclude negotiations between Tel Aviv and anti-occupation resistance factions wherein the opposition holds leverage. So if the investigation focuses solely on Kibbutz Be'eri, then it may overlook some more egregious examples of the directive being followed, such as the Nova Music Festival, which was attacked that day. The Ynet report says some 70 vehicles, many of which contained Israeli captives, were exploded by Israeli helicopter gunships, tanks, and drones. They said, quote, at least in some of the cases, everyone in the vehicle was killed. And Haaretz, back in November, had reported on Israeli helicopters flying on Hamas targets and killing Israeli civilians fleeing the festival. So the Ynet investigation continues. The instruction was to stop at any cost any attempt by Hamas terrorists to return to Gaza, using language very similar to that of the original Hannibal Directive, despite promises by the defense apparatus that the directive had been canceled. And supposedly they changed the directive in 2016, although what they changed it to is unclear. The Hannibal Directive was exposed in 2014, I believe, during the 51-day war on Gaza. But as I said earlier, it dates back to the 1980s. And so the gist of that report from Ynet is that the Hannibal Directive was implemented in all but name that day. So now I have no confidence in this investigation whatsoever by the military or who've been such a big player in the lies about October 7th to begin with. And so, and also they have to cover their own tracks because they're the ones ultimately, well, besides Netanyahu and his men, they're ultimately responsible as well. And so, this is just, I don't know, maybe this is just giving themselves political cover or something. But like I said, I have no confidence in this investigation that anybody will be brought to justice. But it does show that there is some pressure there. Now, this next story is from Dave DeCamp. 6 U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters killed in a drone attack on a U.S. base in Syria. And this was from antiwar.com on February the 5th. So at least 6 members of the U.S.-backed Kurdish-led SDF were killed in a drone attack that hit a U.S. base in eastern Syria late Sunday night as regional tensions continue to escalate. The drone targeted a base at the U.S.-occupied Al-Amar oil field in eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor province. And the SDF said that, quote, 6 of our fighters were martyred during a terrorist attack by a suicide plane. And the UK-based pro-opposition Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the death toll had risen to 7 and that 18 other Kurdish fighters were wounded in the attack, but the numbers are not confirmed. The incident is the most significant attack on a U.S. base since Biden ordered a series of major airstrikes across eastern Syria and western Iraq on Friday, killing around 40 people. The strikes came in response to the January 28 drone attack in Jordan, which killed 3 American troops. The attack on the U.S. base in occupied Syria is seen as a response to those airstrikes. And according to the AP, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, a shadowy umbrella of Iraqi Shia militias, took credit for the attack. So U.S. officials have warned that the airstrikes in Syria and Iraq will continue or could continue, especially if there were more attacks on U.S. bases. On Sunday, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan refused to rule out the idea of launching airstrikes on Iran and also said that they're actively planning further strikes. So I'm sure this is just going to continue. And we're locked similarly to Yemen. Biden is going to lock himself into an unending sort of climb up this escalatory ladder with these tit for tat strikes. It's all about saving face and politics ultimately, and this only hurts our national security. Should not. I mean, it's really a shame too that there's just no. It would be really fantastic to see that anti-war sort of progressive coalition with Matt Gaetz and those Freedom Caucus Republicans, whoever is willing to stand together and put forward some war powers resolution to get the troops out of Syria at least. But unfortunately, just like with Yemen, once Israel becomes if once this is all really dependent on on this is all a result of our support, unconditional support for Israel's mass slaughter in Gaza and this wider ethnic cleansing campaign that's ongoing, including in the West Bank. And so, if that's what Israel wants, and that's what virtually the whole establishment wants, then there's just no hope of, unfortunately, in any sort of near term of these politicians getting together and doing the right thing, if ever. So the Pentagon has admitted that it has no evidence Iran was involved in the Jordan drone attack that killed U.S. troops or any of the over 160 rocket and drone attacks on U.S. bases since mid-October. Regardless, the U.S. says Iran is responsible because it arms Iraqi Shia militias. Which is interesting because that also means that the U.S. Is plausibly, as the ICJ would say, complicit in genocide. So, okay, so now this next story, White House walks back false claim that it notified Iraq before launching airstrikes. And this is from Dave DeCamp again on the 5th at antiwar.com. So the White House walked back. Get this, John Kirby lied to the American people. The White House has walked back a false claim it made about the U.S. notifying the Iraq government before launching a series of airstrikes across eastern Syria and western Iraq on Friday. So National Security Council spokesman John Kirby claimed on Friday that the U.S. did inform the Iraqi government, the U.S.'s supposed ally in the country. But Iraq denied the claim, and another NSC spokesman admitted that Kirby's claim was false. So the NSC spokesperson told The Intercept, for operational security, we did not provide any kind of official pre-notification with specific details on these strikes. Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani declared 3 days of mourning for those killed by the U.S. airstrikes, which killed members of the Popular Mobilization Forces, a militia coalition that's part of the Iraqi security forces. The Iraqi government said 16 were killed, including civilians, while the PMF said that 16 of its members were killed. The White House ordered the strikes following the attack on the 28th in Jordan, and al-Sudani has been calling for the U.S. to end the American presence, particularly since a drone strike that came before that, where the United States killed a PMF, I believe it's a PMF deputy commander in Baghdad. And so al-Sudani has been demanding the U.S. leave the country. The U.S. and Iraq did begin talks on the issue at the end of January, but of course now it appears that the status quo will remain indefinitely. And on Sunday night, of course, there was this other attack in Syria where, as I just mentioned, we had 6 of our, we backed the SDF to maintain this occupation of about a third of Syria, stealing their oil, most of their oil and wheat resources, while the Treasury Department crushes them under the Caesar Act sanctions and making sure they can never rebuild after so many years of war. It's unbelievable the fact that these troops are just there as tripwire forces, and meanwhile they're just stealing from poor people. So in January of 2020, Iraq's parliament voted unanimously to expel U.S. troops in the wake of the U.S. drone strike that killed Iranian Quds Force General Qasem Soleimani and PMF leader Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. But the U.S. has refused to leave and has a significant economic leverage over Iraq, making it difficult for an Iraqi prime minister to kick U.S. troops out. It's just unbelievable. I mean, we did liberate Iraq, they say, so I guess we have a right to just maintain an indefinite occupation there too, even if it's completely unwanted. But of course, the Federal Reserve holds the foreign reserves of Iraq's government, and so they can just completely destroy their economy at a moment's notice. And that's what Trump threatened to do after they killed Soleimani. He said basically that they threatened that they would do that, and he said that we will impose sanctions on Iraq, the likes of which you've never seen, which is for sure a reference to the 1990s, the Bill Clinton era, where the sanctions on Iraq um, after the first Gulf War led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, infamously. So threatening to kill hundreds of thousands of people all over again, at least. Okay, so now this next story, again, is from Dave DeCamp on the 5th at antiwar.com. Poll: half of U.S. adults think Israel has gone too far in Gaza. So half of American adults believe the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza has gone too far, according to a poll from AP Norc. The poll, conducted from January 25th to the 29th, found 50% of respondents thought that the slaughter has gone too far, compared with 40,000 when the same question was asked back in November. The new poll shows 31% of respondents believe that Israel's assault has, quote, been about right, while 15% think it has not gone far enough. Israel has killed over 27,000 Palestinians since mid-October, including more than 11,500 children. The opposition to the mass killing of Palestinians is stronger among Democrats, but is growing among Republicans. Only 18% of Republicans said the Israeli campaign had gone too far in November, but that's risen to 33% in the latest poll. And we have seen, excuse me, previous polls that have shown that a very slim majority of Republicans support a ceasefire and also conditioning aid to Israel as a result of the way they've conducted this war. So I think that's something to be encouraged by, at least. The opposition among Democrats has been put on display as President Biden's campaign events, which are frequently disrupted by protesters calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Some demonstrators have called the president Genocide Joe due to his staunch support for Israel. There was actually a video a little while ago that showed security at a Biden campaign event preventing Muslim women in hijabs from actually entering when they had invitations, or I'm not sure what the term is, maybe reservations. They were supposed to be at the event, and then they were not allowed to enter and be in the audience for fear of another protest erupting against Biden's butchering of all these women and children. And so previous polling has shown that a majority of Americans do want the U.S. to press for a ceasefire in Gaza. So this is Dave's referring to that December poll from Data for Progress. And Reuters Ipsos did another similar one that had pretty much the same results. But so this one says 61% of American voters support the idea of the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and a general de-escalation of violence, but that's 76% of Democrats, 49% of Republicans, and 57% of independent or third-party voters. And so once again, I mean, I think it's so important to just notice that the American public's opinion matters so much less than the Israel lobbies. As far as our so-called representatives, senators, and the executive branch is concerned. It's just absolutely disgraceful. And then in keeping with that, as if the American people, all they want is more war, the Senate has confirmed Kurt Campbell, the architect of the Asia pivot, as Deputy Secretary of State. So this is a piece from Dave again on the 6th at antiwar.com. So on Tuesday, the Senate confirmed China hawk Kurt Campbell, one of the founders of the Center for a New American Security, the ultra hawkish, well, I was going to say liberal interventionist, but it may as well be a neocon think tank. Victoria Nuland was once its CEO. But he's now going to be the he's going to hold the second highest ranking position in the State Department, right behind Tony Blinken. Campbell has taken the position after serving as President Biden's top Asia official on the National Security Council, and he's done such a great job that I mean, you can obviously see why he got this promotion. So he worked in the Obama administration's State Department from 2009 to 2013 and oversaw a policy known as the Asia Pivot, which began the U.S. military buildup in the region to prepare for a future war with China. In practice, what it looks like is hundreds of bases encircling China, and the goal is to shift 2/3 of all American air and naval forces into the Asia Pacific to fight China in that war, which so many commanders and secretaries and leaders and all the different branches uh, are preparing for openly, and several of them are saying that it's going to happen here sooner rather than later, like in the next few years. So that's the way that our military is thinking about this conflict, that it's not only inevitable, but it's going to happen soon. And back in 2021, Kurt Campbell said, when it comes to China, the period that was broadly described as engagement has come to an end, and that the dominant paradigm in the US China relationship will be competition. Now, since then, tensions between the two nations have escalated as the US imposed new harsh economic sanctions. They've attempted to cripple China's semiconductor industry, selectively decoupled with various parts of China, including Xinjiang province. They've increased support for Taiwan. We have something like 200 troops on the island, sailing warships to the Taiwan Strait about every month. Of course, Biden has significantly increased the deployments of aircraft carrier strike groups into the South China Sea over what Trump was doing. They're longer deployments and they're more frequent, often even doing dual carrier drills. And I mean, the sorties I always like to point out, because it's hard to even fathom if the shoe was on the other foot. But when Biden came into office in 2021, the year that engagement came to an end, they flew over 2,000 sorties of American spy planes and warplanes in near China's coast, in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Yellow Sea. That's multiple times per day. And you can just imagine what our response would be if Russia or China was doing the same thing. And and of course, it's all in preparation for this war. I mean, they're collecting intelligence for this war. And let's see, we've continued to build up the military presence in the Asia Pacific, securing all these new bases, including in places like the Philippines, where we have bases provocatively close to Taiwan. And we have, of course, bringing Taiwanese troops to the United States to train them for war with the mainland, and, providing military aid and financing purchases of American weapons to give to the Taiwanese, which is just completely unprecedented. All these different things, including the death of strategic ambiguity, which, I mean, that is so completely. That was not even considered under the Trump administration, really, or and when George W. Bush did it, Joe Biden's basically slapped him across the face and wrote that famous Washington Post column about how words matter, and it was effectively confirmed. Well, really, the fourth or so time when Biden said that the U.S. has a defense commitment, will send American men and women to the island to defend them in the event of a war, of an attack by China. Kurt Campbell actually came out and said this time we will not walk back the president's words. And then I want to say it was I can't remember the name of the congressman that asked Avril Haines during a House Intelligence Committee hearing, but she asked him if we should just do away with strategic ambiguity in the light of the president's comments. And she said, I think it's pretty clear to the Chinese what our policy is. Based on the president's words. So Campbell is replacing Wendy Sherman, who retired in July of 2023. His appointment signals the administration is still focused on increasing its military and diplomatic footprint in Asia. Despite the war in Ukraine, of course, the escalating situation in the Middle East, Victoria Nuland, the notorious Russia hawk, credited with being the architect of the 2014 coup in Ukraine, has been serving as acting deputy Secretary of State since then. And while Campbell has been known to focus on China most of his career, he's also a hawk on Moscow. During his Senate hearing, he said he favored more military aid to Ukraine. And in 2022, Campbell said he believed the U.S. could sustain 2 theaters of war as it did during World War II. It's difficult, it's expensive, but it's also essential. And I love this part. I believe we're entering a period where that is what will be demanded of the United States in this generation of Americans. Of course, there's not going to be any vote on or any declaration of war. Campbell's just made the decision for this generation of Americans. So very impressive, and obviously this is really bad news. because this man is no diplomat. So, okay, now this next story, this last story is Raytheon awards $68 million contract to supply Taiwan with glide bombs. And this is from Dave again on the 5th. The Pentagon has awarded Raytheon, the former employer of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, a $68 million contract to supply Taiwan with air to surface glide bombs. The contract is for 50 AGM 154 joint standoff weapons, which can be fired from Taiwan's fleet of F 16s, which have a range of up to 68 miles. The 50 bombs are part of an arms deal that was initially approved by the Trump administration in 2017. The glide bombs are not expected to be delivered until 2028, though. They will be manufactured in Tucson, Arizona, the home of Raytheon Missile and Defense. And according to the South China Morning Post, the deal for Raytheon is the first weapons supply contract for Taipei announced by the Pentagon since the island's presidential elections. Vice President Lai Ching-te of the independence-leaning Democratic Progressive Party won the election and will be inaugurated in May. He is expected to continue moving closer to the U.S. Following the policies of the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, although the mainland-friendly Kuomintang secured the speakership in Taiwan's parliament, the legislative won. China is strongly opposed to any U.S. military support for Taiwan, including weapons sales. The U.S. has sold weapons to Taiwan since severing diplomatic relations with Taipei in 1979. And began providing unprecedented military aid in 2023. The arming of Taiwan and the new U.S. diplomatic support for Taiwan is being done in the name of deterrence, but the policies have significantly increased tensions. And we've covered this before, but speaking of deterrence, there was an old policy that used to be carried out called dual deterrence, which was a way of ensuring that, on the one hand, as part of our strategic ambiguity policy in the context of the One China policy, where where Washington and Beijing agree that there is but one China and Taiwan is a part of China. We still maintain the strategic ambiguity policy vis-a-vis Taiwan, where we would not explicitly say whether or not we would defend Taiwan in the event of an attack if China was, going to compel Taiwan to reunify by force. And so it was very important when you have, as Dave notes here, the Democratic Progressive Party, who are independence leaning, the kind of politicians there who would declare their independence, which could very likely set off a chain of events that leads to war pretty quickly and put the U.S. in a position where it has to go to what would almost certainly be a nuclear war ultimately with China. And so it was very critical before Barack Obama or before 2015. And Gareth Porter has the best piece about this at the Gray Zone. When Tsai Ing-wen became president, before then, I should say, the U.S. would make sure that, China is deterred from attacking Taiwan, and because they don't know whether or not we're actually going to get involved if something pops off between the island and the mainland. And then also we're supposed to make sure that people like Tsai Ing-wen and Lai Ching-te do not attain these positions of power because they are too radical, essentially, and that they could escalate tensions unnecessarily by pushing independence from China. And so, in the meantime, the status quo, at least especially before the Biden administration, they had de facto independence, and now we're much closer to war than we otherwise would be. And this is largely a result of Barack Obama, and toward the end of his second term, abandoning this policy of dual deterrence, which worked for decades. But of course, now that we have Lai coming in to office, it's very likely that Congress, at the rate we're going, is just going to become even more hawkish, and they'll just amp each other up, and we're just going to have more and more problems here. So even though it looks like some of the close calls we've been seeing over the last year between the U.S. and the Philippines may be mitigated in the near term or as a result of diplomacy, there's going to be so much agitation against any kind of diplomatic solutions to disputes between Taiwan and the mainland as a result of the elections. Although we'll have to see. The Kuomintang does have the majority in the parliament, so that could help things. But it remains to be seen.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for coming back on the show today. We'll do it again soon. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I will have one more show at the end of the week.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everybody.